Likewise, in a 1928 Senate hearing, Matilda Burling proclaimed, "It was the mothers who gave their sons to serve their country. It was the mothers who suffered to bring these boys into the world, who cared for them in sickness and in health, and it was our flesh and blood that enriched the foreign soil." Such rhetoric not only privileged mothers' sacrifices above those of wives and fathers, but really almost equates the mother's sacrifice with that of the fallen soldier. And in the end, the legislation excluded fathers entirely, although some did accompany their wives at their own expense. So some of the mothers who testified at the congressional hearings also argued that the trip should exclude even unmarried war widows, arguing essentially that they were not worthy. "You must remember," stated one woman in a Senate hearing, "that many of these widows are girls whom the boys would never have met had it not been for the contingency of camp life. Many of the widows are not worthy." And so she's challenged by the senator and turns back to him, asking if he knows of any wife to whom the words of Kipling's popular poem, "Mother of Mine," could apply. And the senator says, "Uncle," he says, no, he does not. So that such beliefs not only served as the primary justification of the bill, but also went virtually unchallenged, even by those who opposed the passage of the bill. They did so on other grounds, suggests the extent to which these images of this kind of, all-American mother remain sacrosanct in mainstream American culture. And yet, critics of the pilgrimage program did emerge. Here is a group of the white pilgrims, and here we have a group of African-American pilgrims who, as you can see, were segregated. So these are women whose sons have died to fight to spread democracy in Europe, who then are invited to take part in this program on the stipulation that they go on separate ships. So originally the pilgrimages had been billed as a grand democratic gesture in which all bereaved women would be accorded equal honors, but in 1930, after having dodged repeated inquiries, the War Department announced that it would require African American women to travel separately. Needless to say, this decision provoked outrage among African Americans. The NAACP and the Chicago Defender, the nation's most widely read black newspaper, spearheaded a campaign to boycott the pilgrimages unless the government reversed its decision. But the War Department refused, essentially releasing a statement that speciously claimed that segregation was in the interests of the pilgrims themselves. So in the end, at least 25 women did uphold the boycott, writing some very eloquent letters to President Hoover and the War Department, but around 280 disregarded it and did sail for Europe, leaving black communities to debate the ethics of their decision, loyalty to the race, loyalty to the sun, this is a whole other really interesting story that is actually, I'm writing an article about this now, so, and how it intersects with black politics in the 1930s. So deteriorating economic conditions also led to a more jaundiced view of the pilgrimages in the population as a whole. Although Congress approved funding in a period of prosperity, 6 months prior to the stock market crash in October 29, the trips took place at the height of the Depression, right? In the summers of 30 through 33. And thus the image of these pampered American war mothers enjoying first-class treatment on European voyages were in the public eye during the spring of 1932, when another group of aggrieved citizens, the bonus marchers, descended on Washington, arguing for what they felt was their due. So you have this real contrast between how the nation, the federal government, is responding really quite brutally to the demands of the bonus marchers versus the Gold Star mothers. So the most extreme attacks on the pilgrimages, however, came from cynical and misogynist male writers like Philip Wiley. And Philip Stevenson who was the author of a satire about the pilgrimages that appeared in Esquire in 1935. Written in the voice of a pilgrim who had returned from Europe and was addressing a women's club, it was subtitled A Monologue in the True Spirit of Sacrifice by one who proudly gave her son to the slaughter. To emphasize the lumbering, dull-witted character of the assembly, the writer depicted the women as cows, Mrs. Holstein, Mrs. Jersey. The speaker is portrayed as both ignorant, she makes many grammatical errors, and bigoted, she disdains the great black cow, Mrs. Guernsey. But above all, she is presented as bloodthirsty, exulting in the mechanized killing of our dear boys. They never stopped, but only whimpered a little for their mothers and marched straight ahead of them, their eyes open, to make the supreme sacrifice before their Maker. And I thought, she describes this and then says, and I thought, how marvelous. So clearly that disturbing image of the Gold Star Mothers is not intended as a coherent critique of the group's discriminatory practices or of the government's allocation of funds that might have been better spent for other ends. Rather, the writer is portraying these Gold Star Mothers as a group of smug and brainless women so complicit with the state that they did not even properly mourn the deaths of their own sons. And that's the same spirit in which Philip Wiley has a rant in the Momism chapter about the Gold Star Pilgrims. So in World War II, few, if any, large circulation magazines would have been willing to print such a slur against Gold Star Mothers, but letters written to Wiley suggest that his sensationalist attack did strike a chord with readers who had come to view self-identified war mothers with skepticism. They write about, I can't understand, anyone ever claiming to be one, to be a war mother. American women continued to join War Mothers Associations during and after World War II, but they would not be honored on the same national scale in a manner comparable to that of their predecessors. In the 1920s, organized war mothers succeeded in promoting the pilgrimage program in part because they could draw upon a long-standing sentimental ideal of motherhood, and in part because Americans were receptive to the notion that mothers performed a civic duty that should be duly recognized by the state. But by the end of World War II, the assault on sentimental mother love and the discrediting of patriotic maternalism had rendered a program like this virtually inconceivable. Too closely associated with a possessive maternal stance that now seemed pathological, with ethnocentric and racist views that were increasingly attacked as anti-democratic during the fight against fascism, and with ritualized forms of patriotism that struck many as foolish or even sinister, the American war mother had been diminished as a symbol of national unity. Though women would still be lauded for raising citizen soldiers, they would no longer be viewed as mothers of the nation whose sacrifice and suffering equaled that of their sons, entitling them to compensation and acclaim.